areas, brightening up by the afternoon, a high of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question on LBC. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. When you hear who they are, you'll definitely want to do that. We have with us Peter Hain, Lord Hain. He's got a new book out, a novel called The Elephant Conspiracy. We'll ask him about that in a moment. Gina Miller is here, entrepreneur, transparency campaigner and leader of the True and Fair Party. Welcome back. You're a veteran of this now, aren't you, Gina?
Twice.
Nobody likes to be called a veteran, do they? Peter Lilley is here, Lord Lilley, Conservative peer, former Cabinet Minister. Don't think you've got a book to plug, have you, Peter?
Not yet.
One day. And Geoff Norcott has got so many things to plug, you couldn't really list them all. Comedian and host of the What Most People Think podcast, which is, of course, available on Global Player. Lots to talk about today, lots of questions that you can ask. As I say, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and do watch us on Global Player.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's start off with Abdi in Watford. Abdi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain. I would like to ask, would the panel oppose to the US hosting the next World Cup because some of the US states banning women the right to abortion?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it?
That's a very interesting
Because, I mean,
question.
frankly, there's probably every country in the world where you could think of a reason why you shouldn't hold a sporting event there.
Yes.
Gina Miller, let's start with you.
I think that's right. You could probably find every country in the world that had some sort of a human rights issue going on. I don't think this issue is going to go away. This question is going to go away with sporting events. And it has been in the past. I mean, we know from Moscow that was boycotted. Suez in 1956, there was a boycott. I think we're going to find that more sports become more and more political as we go forward, because I think this World Cup is showing that the football players themselves, the sports individuals themselves, are willing to become more political. I do think we're going to have to...
Some of them are. One of our callers in the previous hour said, yes, but what about maybe there's one or two players who, maybe for religious reasons, are not comfortable promoting gay rights?
I think you have to be individual. You can't make people do it. But I have noticed there has been a shift, that sports people are becoming more political and they're using their platform. We saw it with Marcus Rashford and the whole free school meals. And I think that's a positive. I think using a platform when you have it to be responsible and to highlight things in a meaningful way rather than jumping on, making everything apolitical, I think that's a positive, but I do think it's going to ask questions for every other event going forwards. I mean, the next bid in 2030 is going to be very interesting because there's lots of joint bids going on there. And if you look at those, it's going to be very interesting how they put those.
I think just hold it in Switzerland, play safe. Because can anyone think of a reason not to hold it in Switzerland? I'm sure there is one. Peter Lilley.
Nazi gold.
Oh, right. Okay. See?
Yeah.
I've always thought that sport is sport and politics is politics, and you shouldn't pretend that sporting engagements should be related to the policy of the country. When I was young, I went to the Soviet Union on holiday. That I was endorsing.
I went on a school trip. I was indoctrinated.
Oh, well,
not very successfully, but
This is confession time.
When Mrs. Thatcher wanted to stop our participation in the, I think it was the Olympics because of the invasion of Afghanistan, I thought that was a mistake. So it's not that I don't choose the political reason. I just think it's a mistake. And now we've seen people go to countries, but then use it to virtue signal by taking the knee or wearing armbands. I think that's nonsense.
Peter.
If they really object to it, they just shouldn't go.
Peter.
Well, not surprisingly, I don't agree with Peter. I think that as citizens, whether you're a footballer or a cricketer or a rugby player or whatever sport you take part in, a man or a woman...
You've taken part in the odd sporting protest, haven't you?
I have.
Back in the day.
Yes, exactly. And I heard this argument, Peter says you've got to divorce sport from politics. Well, in the South African case 50 years ago that you're referring to, when I led campaigns to stop the Springboks, because they were all white. The black Springbok captain, Siya Kolisi, who lifted the World Cup in 2019, could not have played for his country when we were protesting. And it was because we stopped those tours that was part of the reason why the change happened. But I think the idea that sport can be that suddenly when you're a sports person, you don't have feelings about whether it's LGBTQ rights or whether it's anti-racism or whatever it is, that I think is gone. And it should never have applied anyway, because we're all citizens with our views and so on. As to where the venues should be, I'm sure FIFA are regretting ever awarding it to Qatar, and how on earth Qatar got it and in what circumstances.
Well, I think we all know.
Yeah, well, there you are. So, and I hope that FIFA will choose venues in the future that are less controversial. But, however, there's almost, and you made this point, almost every country will have criticisms of it. And you've got to have a situation where sport can proceed, but at the same time, people can express their views about what's
just to
might be
address
happening.
Abdi's question, though, I mean, do you think there's a case for, I mean, a similar case here in 2026 when America's going to host the World Cup and you've got various states banning abortion? Do you think that there will be a movement there to make protests?
Well, I don't know whether those states will be hosting any events for a start, but I think that the players ought to speak, competitors ought to speak out about this denial of women's rights and the women's rights to choose. So the fact that sports people, and it started only a few years ago really, sports people didn't feel able to say anything. After the Black Lives Matter movement, Lewis Hamilton, to his credit, took a real stand, but he also said, look, as the only black Formula One driver, I'd never been able to speak out before. And I think this is true of a lot of sports people, and officialdom, to its credit, and the media are now giving expression to that in a way that they never would have done before. John Taylor, the only British international, Welsh international and British Lion who refused to play against the Springboks in 69-70, was ostracised at the time, heavily criticised. Now, I think sports officials would find it very difficult to criticise Harry Kane for trying to wear an armband and so on.
Geoff Norcott, there is some hypocrisy here, isn't there? Because the England team took the knee.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's officially sanctioned by FIFA or not, but what's the difference between taking the knee and wearing an armband?
I don't get it. I honestly don't get it. It's a very strange world for people that like football, is that you've got, of all people, Harry Kane at the centre of an international row over LGBT rights. It just seems such a bizarre thing for us to be contemplating. And if you're talking about what was being asked, it wasn't two blokes snogging on the pitch. It was wearing an armband, which expressed an individual belief that you believed that love should be possible between two men or two women. That doesn't seem like too much to ask. And in a way, agreeing to a point with Peter, if that is too much to ask, fair enough. I understand there's an argument for respecting the culture and the laws of where you are. Maybe we just shouldn't be there then. If you can't respect that simple principle in public, if you can't just sort of endorse an idea, maybe we shouldn't be there. And there is an argument that they have been hoisted a little bit by their own petard, because we've sort of found that there's kind of like a red line issue. And what are we honestly saying here? We're saying that, well, what are the consequences? That he might get booked? What, he might miss a group game? That doesn't seem too bad a consequence for me. We're saying that...
I don't think we want Jude Bellingham to miss a group game, do we?
Well, Harry Maguire we could live with. But, if anything, there were people saying that we should give the armband to him.
He did all right today.
He did do all right today. But I am astonished. And I found it... Look, I'm not the big deal in all of this as a straight man.
As a Wimbledon supporter.
As a Wimbledon supporter. I mean, I always drop a few things. AFC Wimbledon. The fact that I did comedy gigs out in Afghanistan. I don't like to mention any of this stuff. But I found it weird, watching the game. I don't know how your listeners felt, but when that first goal went in, I felt nothing, because I felt like we'd already lost.
I felt quite a lot when the fifth one went.
Yeah, I did. It got better as it went on. I'm a complete hypocrite. But in the face of the Iranian team, who took a genuine risk, I mean, it really was sort of chalk and cheese. I mean, there is the genuine risk of sanctions here. I don't think for 1 second that FIFA or Qatar are going to get to a situation where Harry Kane is being banged up in a prison for something he's done or said. We might have won the game impressively, and fair play to the lads out there. They did all they could, which was work really hard, but it still felt like we lost in a way.
Paul says on a text, 6 opportunities today to hug and kiss a bit longer than usual.
Well,
this is where I think if you want to make your own protest, that's the sort of thing You do. And I'm sure some team, some player, at some point, they're going to find an innovative way where that FIFA can't punish them.
But isn't it the breadth of human rights travesties that's going on in that country as well? Because, people are not talking enough about guardianship of women, that they have their entire life treated like children. The workers, it's not also it's one thing. 2,000, there's so many things
Three,
that are
not
questionable.
3,000. 3,000. No,
Well, that's what they say. But I'm just saying that there are so many transgressions here that and the things that don't feel right. It does raise a question: should actually it have gone ahead? I think that's actually a much bigger question.
It's amazing that not one player, not one of the high-profile pundits. I understand that there are forces that compel them as players once the FA take the decision to be there and national broadcasters. But it is really weird. Not only, a few in the case of Gary Neville and David Beckham have gone there for a lot of money, but not one pundit or player has actually taken a stance. I find
that's not quite true, because if you watch the BBC coverage today, they started off. And indeed, on yesterday's programme at Qatar against Ecuador, they started off by talking about this, and it did pepper their comments.
Talking about is one thing, but I think
what
a
else
lot
are
of
they
people
supposed to do?
will not be there in the first place. And certainly when it comes to the players, people like Gary Neville, who's lectured us at length.
You can't have BBC and ITV boycotting a tournament that the team isn't.
I'm not asking for BBC and ITV to boycott a tournament, but if you think about the kind of stances morally that a lot of people take that work within our industry, being on television and radio, I'm just saying it's a surprise that not one player, not one of the coaching staff, out of all that large body of people that you would imagine have principles, not one person has stood up and said, I don't think I can actually be here for this one.
But they have spoken out, Geoff, haven't they?
Speaking out,
in a way that I think's to their credit. And I think Gareth Southgate has handled the issue very well. And to be fair, I was listening to the Football Association chair or chief executive, I'm not sure which, on the radio this morning. He was very clear about what should or shouldn't be happening.
It's just words, though, Peter. They're just more
No, I think it is going to make it difficult for FIFA in the future. I think it is good to make it.
Yes, and that's a good thing.
They said the BBC had their say at the beginning of their broadcast last night. But they've also, as everyone's rightly pointing out, they've almost set a precedent here for opening ceremonies. And the next time we find ourselves at a sporting ceremony with dodgy human rights records, would the BBC do the same in China? Would they do it in China? Would they do it in Saudi Arabia? Let's see going forward.
I mean, Peter, what would you like to see going forward? Do you just think that there should be this barrier between sport and politics and never the twain shall meet? Because it's more or less impossible nowadays, isn't it?
Well, I don't particularly want to know the political opinions of sportsmen on the field. Your case was rather different because the politics was on the field.
It was, yeah.
It wasn't.
It was unique in that respect.
And on cricket, I think we had the choice of either not participating or not fielding our. Wasn't he captain who was a non-white?
Basil de Oliveira.
Yes.
Who was not allowed back into the country of his birth playing for England. That's right. By the South African government.
Then it's on the field. You obviously have to take a view. I mean, if they say to me, my colleagues can't come on the field or can't come there on business or whatever reason, I'll say, right, I won't go. But to just have a list of their political opinions on their arms, why don't we have the full list of all their political opinions on every field? I mean, it's just absurd.
But you couldn't have a free-for-all, though, because I mentioned earlier in the programme, Robbie Fowler was booked for lifting up his shirt, and there was a thing supporting Liverpool Dockers on the front of his T-shirt underneath, and he got booked for that. I mean, I'm not sure I want to see all of that sort of thing in every match when somebody scores.
But this came from football. The One Love Directive came from within football. I think maybe in a way that's what's so galling about it. This was something that they gained great sort of social and moral capital from, and it seems like at the first time when those principles were tested, they blinked.
Well, I'm not sure we've solved that one today, but it's beyond us. We'll see if we can do better after the break. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Gina Miller is here, leader of the True and Fair Party. Peter Lilley, Conservative peer, former Cabinet Minister, and Geoff Norcott, comedian and host of the What Most People Think podcast, and Peter Hain, the author of this new book. It's called The Elephant Conspiracy, and it's a novel. Now, you've written a couple of novels before, haven't you? Is this where you're heading now? Forget the political memoirs, you've done them. Let's become a novelist.
Well, this is the sequel to the Rhino Conspiracy, which is about wildlife being poached and driven to extinction by international criminal syndicates protected by corrupt politicians. So that's what the thriller is set. It's set in South Africa, and the first one focused on rhinos. This focuses on elephants.
There's a whole series coming up now. Lions, giraffes.
Well, funny you mention that. I'm in the middle of writing the third, and it looks like maybe called the Lion Conspiracy, because actually there are fewer lion. I didn't realise this until a week or two than rhinos.
Really?
Few, and that's because of their claws and their teeth and their skins are now precious, particularly in East Asia, but not exclusively. The rhino tusks are ground down into powder, which have then become cocaine substitutes and aphrodisiacs. I mean, can't imagine how these sort of elite East Asian rich elites.
But there's a whole joke coming in here somewhere, isn't there?
Well,
I just dismissed about three in my head. I saw Rolodexing for inappropriate jokes. I dismissed every single one.
And I did.
It's grotesque and it's obscene and it's just, well, any kind of terrible adjective you can think about it. And, animals like the elephant and rhino on the edge of extinction, and our rhinos and now lions as well.
What you're doing here is not writing fiction, you're writing faction. You're basing a novel on factual things that are happening.
Yes, it's a thriller, and some of the characters are based on real-life people. So you've got to kind of identify who they may be if you're particularly interested in South African politics. But it's all started with me visiting.
Does the word Zuma appear anyway?
The former president.
Yes.
The former president. And
I feel I can get away with mentioning his name.
Now, yeah. You mean you're not immediately struck off the programme? Well, quite rightly, because he had a decade of corruption, which betrayed Nelson Mandela's values, which is why, I feel so strongly about it as a former anti-apartheid protester, that those values that Mandela and that generation extolled and implemented so fantastically when apartheid was defeated are now just being trashed.
Well, it's called The Elephant Conspiracy, published by the Muswell Press, $14.99 in paperback. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Raymond in Liverpool, who texts, the CBI are calling for more migrants, whereas the government doesn't appear to be as keen. Who does your panel agree with on this? And is it time to have a serious conversation about immigration? Geoff Norcott.
I feel like we've had quite a lot of serious conversations about immigration going back to about 2015. Who do I agree with? Well, first up, I think there has been a lot more immigration, certainly coming from outside the EU since we left the European Union. And, as somebody that voted Leave, I don't know how many other Leave voters felt this way, but I was never against, sometimes having high levels of immigration. The one thing that I felt was that it shouldn't be unlimited in perpetuity. So there are times, clearly as now, I think, we've got 1 million job vacancies in the workplace, There's a very compelling argument for having people to come and fill those vacancies. Peter Lilley's shaking his head at me very serious. Not 1 million vacancies, or?
1.3, actually.
1.3, but you're just disagreeing with the general principle of having more migration. Well, I think, at the moment, even if you're talking about what is likely to be this year of 250,000, that is still pretty high by historical standards. If you think of, a place roughly the size of Reading, I don't know why Reading is always used as the sort of archetypal sort of size of town for this kind of thing. All those people need things. They need doctors, nurses, they need care, and they may well contribute a lot to the economy in the long run, but at the point where they arrive, they need things, and it's very difficult, I think, to plan for what your economy needs to give people if you have uncontrolled migration.
Well, Peter, seeing as you were shaking your head, let's come to you next.
The argument that large-scale immigration is good for growth has been tested to destruction. Over the last 2 decades, we've had the highest level of immigration.
I didn't say it was good for growth, I said we've got a lot of vacancies.
I'm not saying your argument, but the argument of the CBI and others, that it's good for growth has been tested to destruction. We've had the highest level of immigration in our history, and the lowest level of productivity growth throughout that period. So it clearly hasn't worked.
Why hasn't it been the wrong kind of immigration?
No,
by which I mean that it's been predominantly at the lower end.
No, it's been a mixture of skilled and unskilled. And and the CBI are quite happy with both. They want cheap labour and cheap skills. The two things that make a country richer, make it more productive per head, are more investment per head and more skills per head of the existing population. And the one thing that gives a disincentive to businesses, both to invest and to train, is the opportunity to import cheap labour and cheap skilled labour from abroad. And that's why we've seen investment per head decline and skill training effort by businesses decline over the last 20 years. And we must stop giving in to business who want cheap labour. I, for a while, was chairman of a small German company, employed maximum 200 people. When it acquired a British subsidiary, the first thing it did was bring the British workers over to Berlin and train them up to German standards. Can you think of a British company which would do that? They'd say, oh no, we'd sack the British workers and employ Poles or something. We've got to change the culture so that we put training first and not importing skills.
Peter Hain, that all sounds incredibly logical, doesn't it?
Well, I'm in favour of putting training first. And one of our appalling policy records, particularly in recent times, is our failure to invest properly in training and apprenticeships. I mean, what this government's been doing is running down the FE sector, not really supporting... Well,
you've got a Secretary of State for Education who used to be an apprentice now, so maybe that'll change.
Yeah, well, maybe. But you've got to invest in it. You see, one of the reasons we've had a terrible growth record, one of the many reasons, is not actually to do with immigration levels and importing cheap labour. It's to do with a failure to invest in our workforce. And that costs money. And the government is not prepared to, because we've been cutting spending massively over the last 12 years, and we're about to start doing it again. And so, every other country that's done better than us has actually invested in skills.
Absolutely.
That's the reason when you get growth, you get investment in skills for higher productivity.
Exactly.
Also, you get... we need a different economic order in which the public sector is not seen as the enemy of growth or the enemy of progress, but in working in harness with the private sector, as used to happen before this neoliberal era in which the public sector is regarded as bad. You've got to slash public spending, and actually the private sector can't always pick up the slack.
But you two seem to agree there on most. Maybe, Peter, you didn't agree with the last bit, but most of that, I mean, you come from a left-wing background, you come from a right-wing background. Now, if you can both agree on that, why haven't things been better over the last 20 years?
Where I don't agree with Peter is that immigration is a bad thing. I think where you've got people who are filling slots that are clearly not being filled at the moment, as Geoff said, 1 million vacancies and so on. When you've got that situation, then you should have a points-based system like other countries do.
But we do.
Well, it doesn't work, though, does it? I mean, the problem we've got at the moment is masses of illegal immigration across the dangerous situations across, yes, but also actually the level of immigration overall hasn't really fallen. The colour of it has. Instead of white Europeans, it's brown migrants from elsewhere, and nothing wrong with that from my point of view, but it hasn't actually cracked the problem that Brexit was said to be the answer to.
Well, I always repeat this when people say that, is that during the referendum campaign, I remember saying on this programme, if you're voting to leave because you think the level of immigration will come down, it probably will from the European Union, but not overall, because until we get the kind of investment that Peter's talking about, inevitably, business, as we've heard today from the CBI, Gina Miller, is going to want to employ people at a cheap rate.
No, but
I'm asking Gina.
I was on the road saying that the colour of immigration would change. And actually, till June of this year, in the last 12 months, it's been the highest level of immigration that we've seen on record. So it's 1.1 million up to June this year, in the last 12 months. I think the thing is, there has been decades of lack of investment in training, education, and absolutely agree with that. The problem is where we are now is that we need to have transitional immigration to take us to where we need to. Because while Peter says it's cheap, actually 44% of senior consultants in the NHS are talking about leaving. We've got 50% of doctors who, we have got major problems in our NHS, in our public services, in our industries. And we have to be realistic about how we get to a better place. But to suddenly say we can't have immigration.
Exactly.
And we have to transition to that. We can't keep on going on saying that in the past, this is what we should have done. The reality of where we are, the honesty of where we are right now, is we do not have the skills in this country to fill the gaps we need to grow our economy. That is where we need to start from. And therefore, we need a period of transition.
How do you manage that, though? I mean, does the government say to farmers, OK, for 5 years, you're going to have X number of people to come and pick the crops, but after 5 years, you won't. So make the arrangements that you need to make.
Yes. You need to start having a plan, a people plan, not just for the NHS. One talks about, a plan for the people. It's actually for every sector. And we have to start talking about the NHS, for example, is the cap on doctors, the number of doctors we train in this country. It's not possible for the population size to be training only 7,500
Why
doctors.
would you cap the number of doctors?
None of these policies work because they're not looking at where the population is now and in the future. And when it comes to social care, I'm sorry, but we haven't even touched the sides on the people we have here to actually look after the ageing of our population. And that is a burden on the NHS. That's 50% of beds are being blocked because people are discharged into the community. We have got to be realistic about the skills we need right now.
Peter, do you accept there are sectors of the economy that, as Gina says, will need some sort of transition?
Well, they may need a transition, but we better start with that transition, not saying we're going to expand migration or continue it. The NHS, last year we turned away 20,000 British applicants for nursing places, and the year before, and the year before, the year before. Why? Because there's a limit on the numbers. Because
they can't afford it.
No, it's not because of that. It's because the NHS can't afford it.
No, it's because
the
government
nurses
hasn't
can't
funded the
afford it.
NHS properly, Peter.
OK. For whatever reason, it's happened. And you haven't complained about it. No one's complained about it except me in the House of Lords. I'm the only person who says it again and again. No one has mentioned that we turn away 20,000 willing applicants to be nurses every year. Why do we do it? You don't know, do you? Because you've never asked. It's because the NHS says, we can't provide the training places for them.
Because they haven't got the funds,
Because they have got
Peter.
the funds.
Well, they give them the funds, but we gave them an extra
But your
few
government
billions.
hasn't given them the funds.
Oh, come now. We've given them billions and billions of pounds of funds. Why do they not make it the priority? And why aren't you calling on them to make it the priority? Not just give more money, but make sure the money is going into training.
Well, it's your government. You asked them.
OK, I am. I have been campaigning for it. I'm not making a party political point. I'm making a sensible point in the interest of the country. We also, as you rightly said, turn away 2/3 of the applicants for doctors' places in this country.
Which is mad.
Which is mad.
Well, we can all agree it's mad. That's a good way to go to the news. It's 8:31 on LBC, the news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Officials in Indonesia say the majority of the 162 people killed after an earthquake there are children. It's thought more than 13,000 people have been displaced as a result. Wales are taking on the USA in their first appearance at a World Cup for more than 60 years. England had a strong start, beating Iran 6-2. The England and Wales captains did not wear their anti-discrimination armbands as planned in fear of sanctions from FIFA. And Shamima Begum's lawyers have told a court she should be treated as a victim of human trafficking. The 23-year-old is challenging a decision to remove her British citizenship after she travelled to Syria to join the Islamic State group in 2015. LBC weather, patchy rain for many in the north and west overnight, drier elsewhere with a low of -1. Cloudy with some showers in the south and east tomorrow. A brighter afternoon though, a high of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 on LBC. We have Peter Hain, Peter Lilley, Gina Miller and Geoff Norcott with us. Geoff, your podcast, What Most People Think. Why'd you call it that? Because how do you know what most people
Well, I don't anymore, evidently. If you look at the polls, it's what a minority of people think. I've seen it change, both on Brexit and the Conservatives. But I suppose the point of the think it's not actually a left or right thing. Well, sometimes it is. But mainly, it's just trying to get to sort of a sensible mid-ground view. One of the things we were discussing...
It's centrist dad you are, aren't you?
I'm
really?
a right-wing centrist dad. It's so funny when you get these people saying, I think I'm an edgelord, or he thinks he's out there taking risks. I'm absolutely not. The only thing is the context of comedy being so overwhelmingly left-leaning. In a relative sense, I am. But I really am the most middle-of-the-road bloke ever. I drink the lager I'm supposed to drink. I watch films about aliens fighting. But I'm partially informed, some would argue less, about politics, and I'm quite happy to draw big conclusions on that basis.
Sometimes you have guests on your podcast and sometimes you don't. I quite like the ones where you don't. And I'm thinking, has he got any kind of script here? Because sometimes I think you must have, but actually it doesn't sound as if you have.
Yeah, I saw it off the top of my head, mate. I just sit there, I riff it. No. What I tend to do is I just go out and walk.
A bit like this programme.
Yeah. I mean, can you tell that there's not much to no, I tend to go and walk the dog, and then I just, like Alan Partridge style, do a few voice notes, and then I use those as beats. And believe me, I like the ones where it's just me being a complete narcissist.
Can I just tell you, talking of Alan Partridge,
yeah. This
weekend on Sunday evening in Thorpe St Andrew in Norwich, I am turning on the Christmas lights.
Can I be? He's got that sidekick guy. Can I be? Yeah. Can I be that for you, Simon? Sidekick Simon,
exactly.
Is it?
I think we better move on. Let's go to Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Iain. Hello, panel. Can any of the panel name a single tangible benefit of Brexit?
No.
Okay. Okay. Peter's given his answer. Let's move on to Geoff.
Well, I can name one, definitely. I mean, look, I'm not as combative as I was on this subject. I think
I'm not surprised.
We've all, it's
a shambles.
No, but we've all,
a shambles.
We've been out of there. 36 months. I think that for me, what I've realised is that there's something that I value that a lot of people don't value as much, and that is the lawmaking democratic element of it. That is a really important thing for me. But we've all grown up with this process and had various debates and arguments and been banned from WhatsApp groups and so on. I've realised that that's not something that other people value as much, and they're happy for more centralised lawmaking to occur. So as much as I can see, like, you'd be a fool not to acknowledge the economic drag that Brexit is having in concert with a number of things. You can't just close your eyes to the fact that it is affecting economic performance. But it is 36 months since we left the EU. One thing that concerns me more than anything is whether this political class, and that's Tories and Labour, have the gumption or the skill, if there are benefits to be had, whether or not they have the skill or vision to make capital on those. Because one thing that has happened is since we've left the Europe, we've become more like Europe than ever before. Bigger state, higher corporation taxes. It's a bit like, when David Brent in The Office leaves Wernham Hogg and then goes back wearing the jacket that the new guy's wearing. I feel like that a bit with Europe. We're sort of wearing the same jacket as Mark in Swindon, and I think that Mark from Swindon branch. So yeah, look, I totally understand people's anger at this point. It's obviously having a drag on the economy, but it feels early in the process to be making fundamental changes on that relationship.
So you accept that from an economic point of view...
When did we leave?
No, when we left.
January 2020.
Yeah, so 36
it's actually less than 36. But
yeah.
Gina?
I always find this argument about the law interesting, because Parliament is sovereign, and that hasn't changed. When we joined Europe, when we left Europe, Parliament has been sovereign, and we've been at the table in every discussion. We've been part of it. We didn't have a Norway-style deal or a Swiss-style deal where we had no voice and we couldn't say anything. So I always find that one quite an interesting defence. But
there are decisions made in Brussels. We don't necessarily find out who made them, and we don't have a direct way of removing the people that made those decisions. That, as I say, I don't expect everybody to care deeply about that, but it's something that I do.
No, and we ceded some sovereignty. Yes, we did cede some. But getting back to benefits, I can't see that there is a tangible benefit, because I don't believe that Brexiteers ever had a plan. It was an ideology. There was no plan. There was no impact study. There was no modelling. There was no plan. So how can there be benefits? To have benefits, you would have to have had a strategy and plans in place. And I can't see any. Even up to now, I can't see any.
That's absolutely true for Northern Ireland at the moment. They never had a plan for the consequence to the island of Ireland. And
but if I run, I'm a business person. If I came up and went to my shareholders or went to everybody and said, right, I'm going to do this, they'd say to me, so what is your plan? Where's your workings out? Where's your business plan? Where's your financial forecast? Whatever. That's what we would have expected for such a big decision. And I kept saying that these are the impact studies. Actually, by law, they were required. We never had them. So I just don't see how it's possible.
Peter Lilley.
Well, I agree with Geoff that the principal thing is getting back control of our own laws. To what extent have we used it? Not enough. But today I've just come from a bill in Parliament called the Precision Breeding Bill, supported by the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and ourselves, and the agricultural industry and so on. Possible only because we've left the European Union to introduce modern scientific methods to breed and produce, improve our agriculture. On Thursday, the Chancellor announced the abolition of 100 tariffs on products imported and used by British industry at the request of British industry. No one mentioned it, but that's important. He also announced that in 5 areas, artificial intelligence, green technologies, medical science, advanced manufacturing and something else, by the end of next year we'll have deregulatory packages in each of them. Should have been earlier, absolutely right, but they're going to happen. Before that, this time last year, if you remember, there was great shortages of HGV drivers. All disappeared. Why has it disappeared? Because we changed the regulations on training them, speeding up, getting licenses and so on. Half the changes we made to do that, we were only able to make because we'd left the EU, because it involved changing EU legislation. We had before that, vaccines. People say, oh, well, that was vaccines. It only saved hundreds of lives. There are hundreds of people...
We could have done it anyway, Peter.
No country in Europe was able to do it. We couldn't in practice have done it.
Yes, we could have done.
Anyway. Why did no one do it within Europe? We could, outside Europe, do it. We did do it. We saved hundreds of lives in this country, thousands of lives in this country, hundreds of thousands throughout the world. People say, oh, well, that's important, actually, people being alive, thanks to that decision. So there have been changes, not nearly enough, but we're moving in the right direction at last. And there's a little
limit on your inward investment, because actually the two things that when you were talking about deregulation that will bring all these opportunities. Actually, they will bring opportunities if we attract investment, and our inward investment will come when we have regulatory certainty and we have fiscal credibility. And we're lacking both of those things because there is an ignorance.
To do with the EU.
No. What I'm saying is, but it's about regulation. It's about regulatory alignment is very important. And this idea that we're going to drop our regulations and suddenly everything will be a benefit. Actually, that's not how integrated supply chains work. And it's not how, as we move forwards, the world is converging on regulation rather than diverging. And so we think that that's going to be a huge benefit. I have not spoken to a single industry who thinks that will actually result in benefits.
You should have spoken today to the NFU about this bill going through Parliament. So that's one concrete example. You should have spoken to the developers of vaccines because they thought that was an advantage. You should talk to the HGV drivers because they think it was important. And I bet you the financial services, the advanced intelligence, whatever it is, AI, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, green technology, medicals, they all want to see the legislation under which they work more user-friendly, less onerous. And from our point of view, if it makes them more competitive at home, they'll be more competitive abroad. It's not just a point of attracting international investment.
But nobody's suggesting that we should just abolish all EU regulations. And there will be sectors, I think you're absolutely right, where alignment will still continue. But the point is that we now have the power to decide which of those sectors we decide to deregulate in and which we don't. Now, you then have to trust the politicians to make those decisions, and they will, of course, be pressured by different industries to either do it or not do it.
Well, I've asked financial services, it's my world, my other hat. Now, I've often asked this question about which regulations, or even in food and the beverage industries, which regulations particularly is it that you want to get rid of? And if you look at a lot of them, they are there for protection, consumer protection, for health and safety. They're actually things that protect consumers and protect retail investors. And the regulations that I can see from most of the people I've spoken to that want to be gone actually benefit corporates and will benefit. It shifts the burden of proof. And that is not good. The whole point was to increase regulations that protected the small person, regulated small companies and regulated so that people were protected. And that's what I worry about, because the regulation that's going to be got rid of benefits corporates.
Can I say, I mean, one thing, I was never an ideological Brexiteer. It sounds semantic, but I think there's a difference. There are people that voted leave and there are people whom it was a project for most of their life. One of the reasons possibly that the person is asking this question is that we're discussing closer relationships. I don't think that things should necessarily be fundamentally changed without, at the very least, a general election. But the idea of greater cooperation at a time when the Eurozone is likely to be in recession next year, I know some of the European economies will escape it, like France, but Germany will be in recession. I mean, this era...
They're all doing better than us.
They're all doing better. No, I just acknowledge
we're
that.
at bottom of the pile with the
but when did
G7
I say they weren't? I said the Eurozone will be in recession. I said, and some of the major economies will be doing better than us, but Germany will be in recession. And yeah, we will be underperforming against the German economy. But I do think that, given the circumstances...
Not next year, won't they? They're scheduled to have bigger recession than us.
We all need to work a bit closer. And I think the era of both the UK and the EU governments indulging in this macho posturing needs to come to an end.
I think it's
Right.
about
Just make one brief point about taking back control, Geoff. We have less control over illegal immigration than we used to have as members of the EU because of under the Dublin.
In what relation was that to the point that I made?
I'm not going
we have less control over our economy.
I was talking about greater cooperation.
We've had a bigger hit than anybody else as a result of Brexit.
I'm going to issue a challenge to Chris in Richmond, who regular listeners will know is a devout Remainer, if not a rejoiner. Chris, can you think of one tangible benefit of Brexit? Let's turn the question back on you.
No, I can't, and I just want to call out some of the tosh that I've heard. Peter Lilley talking about regulations, right? I work in the pharmaceutical industry. If my company or GSK wants to export to Europe, they don't get to choose what those regulations are. Those products have to comply, or you simply cannot export them, right? It just doesn't exist. It's just a fantasy to continue to claim that. And on the vaccines, Google Hungary, they imported the Russian vaccine that wasn't even approved by the European Medicines Agency during COVID. We could have done exactly the same. So please, can we just get some facts correct on this debate? It really enrages me.
All right, Chris, thank you very much indeed. You failed my challenge, but there we go. It's 8:47.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Peter Hain, Gina Miller, Peter Lilley and Geoff Norcott with us answering your questions. I'm very disappointed that no one's asked about Labour's new policy of abolishing the House of Lords, because two of our panels would be out of a job. But
I'm in favour of it.
Actually, I'm going to ask the question. You're in favour of it?
I'm in favour of an elected second chamber representing the whole of the country. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the regions of England should have the opportunity to vote on their directly elected member of the second chamber. It should be by PR. And then you get a totally representative.
Are you not afraid that you'll throw the baby out with the bathwater? Because the House of Lords does do what it says on the tin. It is a revising and amending chamber, and it does that quite well.
And you could, there needs to be a proper discussion about the power, so that it doesn't trump the Commons as the primary elected chamber, and it could still have a proportion of independents because they contribute a lot in terms of proper scrutiny and intelligent
Peter Lilley?
Debate and amendment.
Well, there are two ways of approaching constitutional reform. One, does it work? The other is, does it conform to some abstract idea like democracy? It does work. It doesn't conform to an abstract idea of democracy. Does that matter? No, because if it did, it would just be a replication of the House of Commons. The House of Commons represents Scotland, England,
but other countries have elected second chambers.
They do, and in the case of America, it was designed to try and prevent government doing anything. It was trying to create a permanent lockdown.
That doesn't happen in Australia or Canada.
In Australia, they've had that lockdown between the Senate and the lower house, and the Crown had to stand in and resolve it. It's always either the Crown or the courts that have to resolve conflicts between two elected chambers. And I don't want to see us getting into that position where unelected people have to decide those.
Right, let's move on to an Alexa question from Martha in Welwyn Garden City. I was absolutely gobsmacked to read the story tonight that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is using, thanks for a reminder who he is using this week, is using a private GP that charges £250 for a 30-minute appointment. Is it right that the PM is using this? What do you all make of it? Peter Hain.
Well, he's got the money to be able to do it. And those who've got multi-millionaires like him can do that. And that goes on all the time. I think his problem is that he's perceived as a different on a different planet from ordinary citizens facing a massive cost of living crisis. And that's his problem, holding the seats that Boris Johnson took off Labour last time. He's seen to be different from most people in Britain, in the middle of Britain or at the bottom of the middle or the top of the middle, just can't even begin to afford that kind of money.
Peter Lilley.
Well, if he can afford it, fine for him. These questioners seem to think that it was an excessively large fee for a half-hour appointment with a private doctor. I've never been to a private doctor, I recall, so I wouldn't know how much it costs. It does seem a bit expensive, but if he can afford that much, other people... I go past a pharmacist every day which says private doctor appointments for £80, so he's paying 3 times as much he needs to, but I don't see any reason to stop people having private medicine if they want to. And if they do, they relieve the NHS of a burden.
There is that argument, but he is the Prime Minister, and you kind of want the Prime Minister to have relatively the same experiences as the rest of the country, exactly. I suppose. I mean, that's what the argument would be. Geoff Norcott, have you ever been to a private GP?
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of the headlines around Rishi Sunak seem to be rich bloke who is rich does rich things, God forbid. Look, he used super unleaded when the Norman unleaded was free, and scandalous things along these lines. I mean, look, I might sound like a bit sycophantic or a shill here, but he's the Prime Minister. I mean, what we said he's got to ring up at 8 a.m. and hang on for 36 calls and then get past some receptionist who doesn't want to tell her what's wrong. But
he might then do something about it.
Yes, well...
That's the point.
No, I think he's the Prime Minister of a G7 country. I think he needs to get treatment quickly because I want him out of the business of doing good things for this country and attending to the business. It's like when people, fly to big summits on private jets. Maybe it doesn't look so good if it's a climate summit, but, there's serious business to be attended to. And, of course, there is the other argument as well, and this is quite a live argument, certainly in light of the disclosures from NHS Scotland meetings about whether or not that actually is something we need to be happening in our NHS.
Funny enough, we're going to be talking about that in the next hour.
Well.
That's a radio link there, Geoff Norcott. You're in the wrong job.
But I think that there is an argument that is actually what we need to be happening. And the truth is, it's already happening.
Gina.
I don't have a problem with him paying. I think he's obviously got more money than sense because, as Peter said, that's not the normal, I'd have thought, for a private GP. But it is about him doing his job as Prime Minister and coming up with a credible plan for the NHS. If he then chooses to go and have a private appointment, that is different. That, to me, is separate from him actually going and speaking to the profession. Look at that Nuffield Trust report today. We have serious problems with the NHS. He should be doing that. That's what I want to judge him on. Not on where he's going to go for his appointment, but the actions he's going to take to fund the NHS.
I always remember Margaret Thatcher, when she was asked about why she used private medicine, she said, because I want to see the doctor I want at the time I want. And you can imagine the criticism she got for that. Right, final text question from Lucy in Hornchurch. Heinz are bringing back their baked bean pizza 19 years after it disappeared from our shelves. Does this fill your panel with glee, or is it as bad as pineapple on pizza? We have all the big questions on Cross Question. Geoff Norcott, that's what you were brought up on, wasn't it, baked bean pizza?
So I don't like the leading question there. Is it as bad as pineapple on pizza? That's implying that pineapple is bad. Cheese and what are you going to say next? Cheese and pineapple on a stick isn't the English version of tapas. I think that this is our cuisine. It's the greatest cuisine in the world. I mean, I'm never happier than when I've got a buffet that barely moves 2 fractions either way of beige. So of course, I'm a patriot. I'm delighted to see the return of this pizza.
I'm going to say, so am I, because, when I didn't have much money and everything, baked beans saved me, basically. It saves a lot of people, and they're delicious.
Totally agree. Peter Hain.
Well, is it a gluten-free pizza? Otherwise, I can't eat it anyway.
Really?
No, I'm gluten-free. But
doesn't that just mean you're a fussy eater?
No, it means for health reasons. But anyway, that's a whole other story. It's too much junk food consumed. Sorry, Geoff, I don't want to talk about your private diet, but I mean, there's too much junk food. Kids are fed on pizzas and virtually nothing else, and that's not good for them or healthy for them. End of rant.
Peter Lilley.
It's funny, all our national dishes have foreign names like pizza and cannelloni and other things, and they're all bad for you, as you say.
Yeah, unless they're gluten-free.
Baked beans are
not
technically
good. They're good for you.
Baked beans are technically a pulse. Can I just throw that out there?
As long as there's not too much sugar
in them. Yeah, sugar-free ones.
Okay. Oh, just take all the fun out of life. You know why? You can tell that stuff hasn't got gluten in. You sort of go, I don't know what gluten is, but this, I believe that it isn't.
Well, I'm joining you, Geoff, in standing up for
they could have the baked beans with the little sausages that used to be in the tin and put those on.
I'd still buy those. I'm afraid.
Now we're hearing it all.
We are. Peter Hain, Peter Lilley, Geoff Norcott and Gina Miller, thank you very much indeed. We will be back, of course, with another Cross Question tomorrow at the same time. If you missed any of the programme, you can catch up on Global Player a bit later. Now, in the next hour, we are going to take Geoff's orders and talk about the fact that NHS leaders in Scotland have discussed abandoning the founding principles of the service by having the wealthy pay for treatment. That's you, Rishi Sunak. You already do, don't you? So no change there. The discussion of a 2-tier health service is mentioned in draft minutes of a meeting of Scotland's NHS leaders in September. Shock, horror. Or do you think maybe this is along the right lines? Because if